Hi, everyone. Maureen Droney here with the Recording Academy Producers and Engineers Wing. Welcome to Inside the Mix with Dolby Atmos, Part 5. Today, as a returning special guest, we have David Gould, who will be talking about Atmos and metadata. At Dolby, David is responsible for creating products and solutions that enable creators to do their best work in Dolby Atmos and Dolby Vision. And we're very pleased to have him back with us for another round. Previous to joining Dolby, David was a senior project manager at Avid, responsible for Pro Tools software. Plus, David, as I mentioned previously, is one of us, having started his career in London as a recording engineer at Abbey Road, specializing in orchestral film scoring. Also a returning guest is Mike Ward, Director of Architecture at Dolby Labs. Mike leads a global team of system architects who define and maintain the end-to-end ecosystems that deliver content created in Dolby. A key part of Mike's role is oversight of the growing and, as we know, evolving Dolby Atmos music ecosystem, including the audio formats that deliver content to consumers across, of course, a wide variety of playback devices. Mike knows a lot, and we're thrilled to have him back with us today as well. Once again, holding down the moderator chair for today's discussion is the intrepid and multiple Grammy-winning engineer, Michael Romanowski. Now, remember, we have about 30 minutes for the discussion and then another very valuable 30 minutes for Q&A. So be sure to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function. Also with us again today is Christine Thomas, Head of Music Partnerships with Dolby Atmos, and I am going to toss to Christine to get us rolling.
Thanks, Maureen. Thank you again to the Recording Academy and the P&E Wing in particular for having us. We're thrilled to be here and very much enjoying this series. Just again, we'll continue to remind to please post your questions in the chat and we will, in the Q&A, and we will make sure we get to them to the best of our ability in the second half of the session. At this time, I'll welcome Michael, Mike, and David on screen.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Appreciate it. David, great to see you again. Mike, thank you very much. Both of you, great to see you as well. Great to have you guys both back again, sharing your expertise with us. And thank you, Christine, and thank you, Maureen, for this keeping this series going. And we have an interesting topic today, certainly metadata. So something one of everybody's favorite topics of things. And with that, David, I will turn it over to you and let's jump right in.
Sure, sounds good. Let me just share this up. So yeah, thanks for having me back. Great to be back. Excited to be talking about this. This is a fascinating topic, the topic of metadata very broadly. So Mike and I will spend a few minutes just kind of going through the various different types of Dolby Atmos metadata, how it fits, and then look forward to kind of getting into those questions that you all may have. So for any of you who joined the session a few weeks ago, I can't even remember how many weeks ago, about the various content creation tools, I started with this slide where we talked about what is the overview of Dolby Atmos mixing? What does it mean to mix in Dolby Atmos? And this diagram over on the right here included this wonderful, just simple little arrow and line that says metadata. So the goal of today is really to get into, well, what does that actually mean? There's some metadata that I think we all know and love and think about on a daily basis, and some areas that maybe you're not so familiar with or not so clear on how they impact things, what they're doing. And hopefully we can kind of answer some of those questions so that for those of you working in the format, you've just got a better understanding of how it all fits together. So let's start with the simple stuff. Object metadata, sort of the cornerstone of Dolby Atmos objects. You have positional metadata in XYZ. You have object size. I'm showing a screenshot of the Pro Tools panel here, but this is in many other DAWs. That just happens to be what I took a screenshot of. And if this is not clear to you, you're probably in the wrong presentation. This should hopefully be very familiar to how this works. This is per object, it's time varying, it's stored within the master files, and this is what allows you to work with the objects that have this dynamic metadata that sets their position in space. So hopefully that one's pretty easy. In addition to X, Y, Z and size, there are other parts of per object metadata as well. So even within the panner, there are a couple of other controls that get saved as metadata. We have something called zone masks. So this little drop down here, again, using the Pro Tools panner, for example, you may have seen, you may not have seen, but this actually gives you a little bit more control over how an object will be rendered in a space. So you can see these diagrams sort of show some speakers grayed out. So for example, in this layout here, if you had a sound that started at the front and as you moved it to the rear of the room, you never wanted it to go via the side speakers, but you wanted it to just phantom between front and back, that would give you that control. If you wanted something to never leave the front of the room, or to maybe never hit the front of the room, regardless of where you pan it in the space, and if you accidentally pull it off. These were mainly designed for more, I guess, filmic workflows where you're controlling a much larger space, but they do give additional control to how objects are rendered within space. And when you combine that with being able to turn the overhead on and off, you can have a bit more control of, as you move a mix between different speaker layouts, how that mix will translate. Another one in there is this icon, which is something called Speaker Snap. And this is, again, a per object piece of metadata that allows you to have a sound always snap to the closest speaker, as opposed to phantoming between multiple speakers. Again, in larger room configurations, this can be super helpful. So if you're in a 916 room, if you've maybe got an array of multiple speakers on your side, if you never want a sound to phantom between two speakers, you always want it to be a point source out of a speaker, you can use this metadata to snap that sound to that specific speaker. Again, these are just functions that are available, may not be useful on a daily basis, but it's just good to know that they are there and they are considered part of that per object time varying metadata. Okay, so that was the stuff that you can get to from a panner within a DAW. The next set of metadata that I wanted to talk about is everyone's favorite topic, binaural metadata. So this has been a pretty hot topic in the industry over the past year or so. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why this exists, what it is, and how it's used. So the goal of this binaural render mode metadata is really to give more control over the binaural representation. You know, it was very clear in the early days of figuring out how to translate an Atmos mix to binaural that people making music, people creating this way, need more control over that binaural. It can't just be the thing I did on loudspeakers just maps to binaural and we're done. Or at least that never gave the results that people were quite looking for. And so this idea of being able to control on a per object basis some amount of how binauralized an element is became a really powerful tool. And so this is something that has allowed many of you, I'm sure, to get this sense of depth within a binaural representation that can be very hard otherwise. And we have these four modes, so off, near, mid, and far. And so for each object or each channel of your bed, you can set it between one of those four. Off is a non-virtualized stereo fold down. And while that may seem valuable, it can actually be quite jarring against other parts of a binauralized mix, but it is an option that is there for you for a specific element if you need to have that not virtualized. Near is an anechoic virtualizer. So that is being effectively, if we're playback in an anechoic chamber, but we're virtualized using, you know, HRTF virtualization. And then mid and far are two, you know, depth controls basically. And this allows you to have this kind of intimacy of the kind of sound people are used to on headphones for elements like vocals, percussive elements. You can get that intimacy through the near non-room virtualizer. But then things that want to bring space to the mix, things that want to put you within that environment, you know, whether it's BVs, choirs, vocals, pads, these things that really provide that sense of space around you, those can be in mid and far. And that contrast is something that we've really found can be very valuable to a binaural mix. These are not as if you've just moved something further away in space like a loudspeaker, because it's equal loudness throughout. So one of the goals when we did this was to ensure that this would be something that would impact the binaural mix without you having to then go back and change your loudspeaker mix. And so as you're doing this sort of sense of depth, you didn't want it to suddenly start affecting the level and how things played out as they moved through the space. So these are all equal loudness. So it's not impacting the level of things, it's really impacting the virtualization. These settings they're per object, as I said, or per leg of a bed, but they are fixed for the duration of the song. So this is not a time varying over the course of the song metadata. As I say, it only affects the binaural render. And this is metadata that is utilized today by Dolby's AC4 IMS format, which is our codec specifically designed for mobile delivery to headphones in mobile networks. I don't want to dive too deep into that. I'm sure many of you saw Mike's session a few weeks ago, all about codecs, where you got to go full in on all of this, but it's just good to know that this metadata is something that is understood and used when delivering via that IMS codec.
Hey, Dave, a quick question for you. Can you talk about that? So the differences between, certainly not off, but near, mid, and far, and then maybe a little bit about the development them and the maybe objective with tonality or distance, like maybe the size of the room or the reflections or the tonality of the reflections. Anything you'd like to dig into a little bit on some of the details there would be nice.
Yeah, so this has definitely been a journey that I'm sure some of you on the call have been on with us over the past few years. The evolution of that virtualizer tuning and how that works has been a continuous journey. That's really the best word for it. So as I mentioned, so near is anechoic, and that was actually a change that was made earlier this year. All of this has been done hand in hand with the community, and we've loved the engagements that we have had with many of the folks I'm sure on this call and the community at large, really getting feedback. This has been such an interesting path to go down, and that was what led us towards making near fully anechoic. It was very near anechoic before, on the pun, but we went fully anechoic, and that really helped with getting near to where people want it to be, where it's virtualized, but it's not having any of that coloration that can come from the room. And the overarching goal of all of this has been externalization without coloration. And as you all know, that is the never-ending balance that you're trying to find, because we don't want to color the sound. And so the way we approach developing the room, if you like, for mid and far, was trying to find an incredibly neutral and natural sounding virtualizer. So something that really wouldn't add much color. Now, there are plenty of products in market and plenty of use cases where you want the sound of a particular physical, real room that people may be familiar with. And that can have a lot of benefit if you are familiar with that room. But for people not familiar with that room, that can be very jarring, because they don't have the visuals to tell them how things should sound, and they're not familiar with it. And so trying to find that neutralness of a space that can give you a sense of space, but not color the sound negatively, has been something that our research team has been hard at work on. I think we made a ton of progress. If you look back through various releases, we've been evolving this, but trying to always evolve it in a improve or do no harm kind of way, because we want all existing mixes to sort of carry on working great as we continue to evolve this. And so that's been part of our methodology as well. It's been all about feedback from the community. It's been all about a two-way conversation to make sure that the things we're doing are helping and continuing to improve what is possible with this. So to get to some of your other questions, the mid and far room, they share a lot of the characteristics, but it's just the amount of externalization that you're able to get. So it's not like you're moving to a different space. It's like the space has warped in size around you, which again allows you to have that familiarity, because you can't suddenly put something into one of these modes and have it pop out and feel like it's in a different environment. So the goal is, throughout going from off all the way to far, it all feels naturally within the same environment.
Great. Thanks. Hey, one quick question on it too, and awesome on the development, and you guys are continuously improving this. I think something that some folks may want to know is, as that gets improved, are these changes baked into projects that are completed, or are the improvements of binaural render mode settings happening on the decoding side whenever somebody listens to it? So the improvements are consumer side as well, rather than baked in.
Yeah. So it's always a bit of, well, where the improvement is made actually depends on, you know, if we've also been making some improvements to both the default HRTF as well as the work we've been doing around personalized HRTFs. And so, you know, the work that we do on the HRTF, that impacts a different part of the pipeline versus the work we do on the virtualizer. But the goal of all of this is, you know, any changes that we make on the creation side also make their way to the consumer side. Like certainly from the room point of view, you know, the HRTF we've talked about before, you know, that is something where there is this difference where on the professional side, you can have a personalized experience today, which isn't possible on the consumer side today. But that is really about making sure that you're able to trust what you're hearing. But the room, the virtualizer itself, we work to keep very in lockstep between the creation and playback side.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, so that's binaural metadata. I'm sure we'll get some questions on that. And then we get into the really fun stuff, which is what we generally like to refer to as program level metadata or mix level metadata. So whereas everything else we talked about was you could set it sort of per element, this is metadata that applies to your full mix. And the two main parts of this are trim and downmix controls. Now, these are loudspeaker only controls, so these don't impact the binaural. So these are really designed for different loudspeaker configurations. And yeah, there are specific settings for different rendering loudspeaker layouts. So the first one I'm going to talk about is downmix, and then I'll hand over to Mike to talk about trims and then get into some of the just general metadata considerations and best practices pieces. So downmix metadata, this is a setting within the renderer. We've got a screenshot here. Command T will open that up for you power users out there. And this gives you control over how the 5.1 and also how 5.1x downmixes happen. And the reason why this is important is because most consumer Dolby Atmos systems, or many consumer Dolby Atmos systems, are a 5.1x layout. And therefore, this metadata actually applies how the 5.1 part of that will have been rendered from the Atmos mix. And so for music, we're generally recommending direct render as the control there. So there are 4 different options, which I'll give a quick overview of. But as I say, in general, direct render is the recommended setting for that, and you'll see why as I go through these. So these next few slides are some screenshots from the renderer user guide. So if you want to go back and study this, these are all available for you in your user guide. But these are some diagrams to represent what those different modes do. And they show in the room here, if I had an object panned here, how would it be represented in a 5.1 in each of these different modes? And so direct render, as you can see here in the back right corner, comes out of LS, left surround, in the front comes out of L, and between those 3 positions, it phantoms just all the way down the wall, as you would expect from left surround to left speaker. So all good, makes sense. Now, there are use cases where this is maybe not ideal. Again, depending on the content you're working on, depending on the style of mix, depending on whether you want to really protect your front speakers or protect the environment behind or avoid any comb filtering as things are phantoming if you have a lot of coherent material. And that's where some of these other modes come from. So we have a mode called direct render with room balance. And here you can see what actually happens is the back of the room really gets compressed. So any object that is between the back corner and the midpoint is always rendered fully to the left surround. So you only start getting phantoming when something moves past the midpoint. Now, the reason for this is if you're in a room with a 714 setup and you have speakers to your side, that side speaker phantoming to the front makes sense, but when you're behind you, you don't want it to start phantoming too early because the image can shift. You can also, as I say, if you get this kind of buildup of coherent material, end up with comb filtering as that pans through the room. So this is designed to really make sure that the things that are supposed to be behind ear level stay behind ear level until they should really be in front of you. So that's direct render with the room balance. And so that is something, if you have a mix where you're finding that things are moving forward too early when you check in 5.1, this could be something worth checking out. Then we have low-row. This is sort of a traditional downmix methodology. And this is going from, so it renders to 7.1 and then just basically sums and dips down to 5.1. So this is similar to the direct render with room balance, but is really doing it via a 7.1 and more traditional downmix recipe. And again, this can mean that, so in this exact example, because this object is exactly panned between the two, there is actually a little bit of a bump at the midpoint as it moves through the room, because again, that object is coherent between the two. And so while it's summed and dipped, it's still causing a bit of a bump. And then we have PL2X, and this is really a very sort of old school approach for film and TV use cases, where, as you can see, something that's actually panned to the left corner is rendered mainly into the left corner, but with a little bit in the right corner. And this was really to try and represent that larger room where you didn't want something to very quickly just become a point source. And so it spills a little bit across the back. And then as it moves down the wall, you can see once it's here, it's panning between the right surround and left surround. So it sort of moves the whole thing around you a little bit, as if it were, you know, almost an array of speakers. So this is something, again, that is more designed to fill that space when, if you have material that's maybe just much more reverberant behind you and you don't want that very point sourcey feel, this can help with that downmix ability as well. So that's your 4 downmix coefficients. There'll be a test later. And with that, unless Romy had any questions, or we can hand over to Mike to talk a little bit about trims and front back balance.
Actually, yeah, something you said that, you know, this is available on the website. It might be nice to put this in the chat, or at least put the link to that if Christine has a moment, or if, where people can go visit that and maybe begin a little bit.
Yeah, it's a bit, well, it's actually, any of you who have the renderer installed, it's in the documentation file folder of the renderer. It installs with the renderer application.
Shows how much I look at documentation sometimes.
Well, you know, I was going to make a joke about, I'm sure you've all studied this, so this will be, you know, this will just be a refresher, because I know that you do go through all 400 pages of that. So
we do.
Be good.
We're all jump in with both feet kind of people, I think, you know, or yeah.
No,
right, that's great. I appreciate that. And any considerations for legacy, if somebody's listening to these, you know, on a receiver that only does, you know, ProLogic 2, any thoughts on how this is going to translate to older equipment, or not even relevant? If somebody...
Mike, I'm going to hand that one over to you.
So the parameters that David was referring to are really controlling the rendering behavior for layouts based on 5.1, so 5.1 or 5.1.x, so 5.1.2, or actually indeed any configuration that's based on 5.1. So if you are on a system that is receiving the Dolby Atmos stream but is only actually rendering to or decoding to 5.1, then that's, you know, these parameters will affect how that sounds. And so, you know, we certainly recommend, if you care about that, if you're intending to distribute to an endpoint where those channel-based downmixes will be listened to, Blu-ray might be a good example, then reviewing these parameters and listening to them is a key, could be a key factor. With respect to ProLogic 2 itself, I mean, that's that technology upmixes from stereo, so these don't apply directly unless you're deriving a stereo mix from Dolby Atmos, in which case this parameter would affect that, and additionally the 5.1 to 2 channel downmix, which we didn't actually cover in this presentation, but it's another control that's in that same window, would also impact how that works. Again, for music, we typically recommend that if you are going to downmix to stereo, then the low row setting is probably the best place to start.
Great, thank you. 714 down to 5.1 down. So if you're going down to stereo, my understanding there's a double going down, correct? You're going 714, you're going down to 5.1. Then if you're going to stereo, rather than taking 714 and going straight to stereo. So these parameters come into play in that process.
Yes, correct.
Great. Thank you. I think, yeah. So Dave, did you hand it off to Mike? Mike, you up?
Yes, I am indeed. Hello, everyone. Nice to be back. So yeah, so I'm going to take on going over some of the other parameters that are again program level, and they're all again defined within the same control window within the renderer app. So I'm going to talk a bit about trims. So we've talked about sort of downmix relationships and how things downmix. Trims are the sort of object-based equivalent of downmix coefficients is one way you can think about them. And we use these for controlling loudness and energy buildup when rendering to smaller speaker configurations. So it's worth noting that if you're playing back rendering to layouts of 7.1.4 or higher, there are no trims applied, but if you render to something smaller than that, then trims are applied. And if you don't tell it to not apply them, then there's automatic trims applied. What this was originally designed for was, again, more around AV content. If you have on-screen elements that could be sort of drowned out a little bit by busy off-screen elements that tend to pile up as you're rendering to smaller configurations, then the trims apply to those off-screen elements, or elements that are no longer at the front of the room, and reduce those levels based on the configuration. And it's a sort of automatically applied in the renderer to the objects based on their position and the number of speakers you're rendering to. So, for example, if I'm moving an object from the front to the back of the room, the amount of trims increases as I move more to the back of the room. I think at about 60% back from the front is where you get full, if that makes any sense. Back into the room is where you get the full trim applied for that particular configuration. So that's the background around trims. And if you just leave these settings to automatic, then when you render, then you will actually hear those applied in the mix. However, for some use cases, manual trims can be quite useful. And the trims that we have enabled, we have manual trims enabled for 3 configurations, 5.1.7.1 and 5.1.2, allows you to either disable these trims completely, or you can apply additional attenuation should you wish to do so. For some use cases and content, that can be quite useful. So, for example, and we seem to have found this in for talking to music mixers, setting the high end surround trims to 0 dB, which disables the trims, sort of allows you to maintain front, back, and listen to overhead plane energy. So there is no sort of reduction in level as you move from the front to the back of the room. It's it can be quite useful to review these settings and to listen to them, and to do so per configuration. It's worth noting that you do need to specify these per configuration. So if you set them to 5.1, you doesn't automatically move through to 5.1.2 and 7.1. You need to go into each individual one and set these if you wish those to be manual. 5.1.2, we've included this as a manual control, mostly because it's the most common configuration for consumer Dolby Atmos systems. Much as we would love everybody to be on 7.1.4, that's not the case in the market right now. We're working on it, trust me. But most systems out there are based on 5.1.2. So having trims there to be able to customize for that layout can be quite useful. Back to, again, if you are deriving surround sound mixes from Dolby Atmos for legacy compatibility, then again, looking at the 5.1 and 7.1 trims can also be valuable if you wish to adjust those.
Any recommendations for different deliverables, usage cases? I mean, still we're talking about music over cinema, but any sort of thoughts or things you guys have come across that you may want to consider when somebody is delivering for a specific use versus general public?
I mean, one thing that I was just going to add that we found in some use cases, certainly the overhead trims, for example, there is something. And I'm sure various people on the Dolby team could explain this in more kind of psychoacoustic ways. For the overhead trims, there's something about when something that is overhead is brought down to the sides in the render, it can just appear, it's pointed at your ears more, it can appear louder. And that's one of the places where that overhead trim can actually be very useful to get that a little in control as you've brought those things down, if you're delivering a 5.1, for example.
It's like a vertical pan law.
Yep.
So, yeah. Great, thanks.
All right, another one. This is a little more exotic, but is available in the renderer. Again, we added this to Dolby Atmos based on general desire for more control. Is front back balance. So this operates in conjunction with trims, warp mode, etc., and really allows you to again specify for these rendering configurations where objects are rendered from a front to back perspective. You're allowed to, you can position objects independently using this control for objects that are in the overhead plane and between the floor and overhead plane, and also specifically in the listener plane. Again, allows you to, if you wish to, for these configurations, either move the energy towards the front of the room or to the back. Worth noting, this applies to objects only, does not apply to bed channels. Those are unaffected. Okay, on to metadata considerations and recommendations. So, and David, please feel free to jump in if I miss anything. These are sort of considerations and recommendations that we've come up with during working with music mixers and getting feedback from them on parameters and what they prefer. And so we can go through these. These from our perspective are good defaults to use when mixing for Atmos music. So with respect to the 5.1x downmix setting that David explained, as he mentioned, direct render is a good place to start. But if you do run into issues, then you can either adjust the mix or go and adjust this parameter to see if that resolves the issues. For trims, setting manual trims for the configurations that we've highlighted and setting those to 0 dB, that seems to work quite effectively. Setting front back balance to 0, so that doesn't bias the mixed front or back at all, but just in the center of the room. Those work nicely for music content, and that's the feedback we've been receiving. Again, reminder, trim settings are specific to a rendering layout. So if you set them for one, don't forget to set them for the other if you have configurations that you care about. So that was speaker rendering. Now on for binaural rendering, we really do recommend binaural render mode should be set for each of the channels and objects. So you're consciously making decisions on that, not just leaving everything at defaults. As we talk through, as David talked through, this really does help to create depth between the mix elements and give your binaural representation more space. Allows those elements in the mix that need punch to have that punch, and for those that can be more spatialized to give that larger room impression, you can use the mid and fast settings for that. Worth noting, if for whatever reason your mix is using multiple beds, all the channels with the same assignment, so e.g. all left channels that are present share the same binaural render modes. You can't set independent binaural render modes for different beds of the same assignment. And as mentioned, binaural render mode is used by the AC4 IMS format when you deliver to headphones, so that's then fully delivered to the consumer endpoint. All right.
Real quick, the
Yep.
multiple beds. So sorry, real quick question on that is that's great to know, is that all the lefts must be the same, but I think it's worth noting that you can change within the bed, you could have different settings for the different.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so all the channels can be independently set, but yes, then as you say, all the lefts have to have the same setting, all the rights have to have the same setting, but yes, everything, all the separate channels can have different settings, as it were.
Great.
And that only applies to sort of real Dolby Atmos beds, not any kind of object beds that people may have made where you can then have piled up objects that have very different settings.
Right, because those are each individual objects, and you can treat
Exactly.
them whatever you want. They're not static to the bed, correct?
Yeah, it's just beds under the hood are treated differently, kind of formal Dolby beds. So yeah.
Yes.
Great. Exactly. Thanks.
All right. Last up, some considerations around gapless albums. When creating an album and you wish to have gapless transitions between tracks, generally you would probably want to make sure that all of your program level metadata is set the same for each track. However, the Dolby Atmos system does allow you to have different settings of program level metadata for each track. Again, we recommend that you don't do that, keep everything the same, but it's possible to do so. One note of caution that if there are different values, there is going to be a transition between those values at the track boundary. And this transition is not really dependent on exactly where you specify the track boundary. It's more dependent on the codec that you use to then deliver that content, because that's how the renderer has to deal with that in practice. So if you are, if you specify a transition, a program level transition at a point, there will be a ramp from the previous state to the new state of between 32 to 40 something milliseconds that will happen. It'll happen smoothly, there'll be no mute, but that will happen as a transition. So
I'm glad. I was just about to ask you, what's the time frame on that? So you said 25 to 30 milliseconds. That's great. And certainly knowing in trying to look at albums, not all albums are mixed by the same person all the way through. So knowing you're going to have potentially different settings on tracks, that's the time frame to consider in that transition.
Yep. All right, very good. I believe that is the end of the prepared material.
Thanks, Mike.
Yes.
That's my cue.
That's your cue.
That's my
Can I ask Christine before you jump in? I see there's some questions, but one last thing is that Dave or Mike, if you guys like to the binaural render mode settings, where those, we've talked about this before, but in case somebody hadn't seen, can you talk about where people would be able to experience those? On what platforms would they hear those settings or circumstances?
Oh, so you mean on the playback side, not
on the playback side, on the consumer side, how consumer is going to hear the binaural render mode settings versus those that may not?
Yes. Mike, do you want to take that, just so that, because I think you're probably closer to exactly what services are up?
Sure, yeah. So the majority of services when delivering to mobile devices are using the 84 IMS format, and so yeah, that's the experience you'll be listening on, on most of the services that are out there. The one exception being Apple, that they are not using that format, and so there is a difference in the experience there. But yeah, Tidal, Amazon, others that are in market are using the 84 format on all mobile devices, and that's what you will hear.
Awesome, appreciate it. Thank you, Christine. Welcome
Great.
back.
Thank you so much. Terrific. I always really enjoy these conversations. We have some questions, so let's go ahead and jump in. Mr. Brian Lucy has been busy, so we'll start with a couple of his. Thanks, Brian. So just jumping in my view, the immediate goal needs to be, I'm just going to trim this a little bit, but more about, less about better, mid, and far, and more about near representing the physical room, sound accurately in headphones. David, can you talk a little bit about folding the room into a headphone?
Yeah, and hey, Brian. I mean, yes and no. We are agreed on that. Yes, absolutely. Like this, trying to have that same wow experience of the headphone experience that you get when you're in a room with loudspeakers is absolutely right. Are we trying to exactly replicate the exact experience in the room that you were in when you made that mix? We're probably not trying to do that. We're trying to make this, and this is where I was talking about this idea of a kind of very neutral, natural sounding room that everyone can enjoy without the specifics of a particular room. We don't want Dolby Atmos to be the sound of Bob's studio. Like, that's not what we want it to be. We want it to be this very enjoyable by everyone immersive experience, which we want to be very representative of the sound of a mix in a room, and that has been the kind of the goal all along. Like the magic of the Atmos experience in a room is great, and there are a number of limitations, and I think there are a number of undiscovered secrets to making that possible, that we're constantly trying to discover. And so I think the idea of making mid and far and the various modes better is on that same journey. I think it's all part of the same journey, and those are the ways that we're able to try and get that same magic of the experience of an Atmos mix in a room.
Great, thank you. Going to Ryan Ole, terrific to see your name. If near in binaural is anechoic, how different is it? How is it different than off?
So off is just doing good old render to stereo, pump it into your ear, as if the very unnatural headphone thing that we're all used to, which is something pan full left. goes only into this ear and none of it gets into this ear, which in the real world is not actually possible with sound, other than maybe if you're in an anechoic chamber and had, in fact, no, even in an anechoic chamber, that's just not possible to never get to the other ear. So what an anechoic near is doing is saying, imagine you're sat in an anechoic chamber and your loudspeaker is a couple meters away over here to the left. We're still virtualizing the difference of time arrival, level difference, frequency shielding that your HRTF provides of that sound getting to each ear. So it is virtualizing it, but there is no reverberation to give it any sense of external or any sense of kind of space outside of, it's not just sort of directly injecting it into your ear. Hopefully that answers the question.
Good. Thank you.
Crossfeed, no room. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's doing the crossfeed piece and it's doing the HRTF piece. It's just not doing a room modeling piece.
Yep. Taking another one from Ryan, slightly different question. So if settings don't change from song to song, is gapless playback really gapless?
If a tree falls in the forest, no one's going to I mean, yes, it is gapless, and the goal is to ensure that the metadata changing doesn't break that gaplessness. Mike, anything to add to that one?
No, I think that's a good summary. Even metadata changing at the track boundary you will still get gapless playback. You will not get a dropout or a mute happening. So gapless and seamless are maybe two different things. Obviously, if you do change things, you're going to have a change of, something is going to happen between, the new track and the previous track. But with respect to there being an actual gap like introduced in rendering, yeah, that's not an issue. That doesn't happen.
So related, Ron Salas asks, when going from track to track on an album mix, will changes to the metadata cause glitches at the track boundary, i.e. tracks mixed at different times with different settings?
No. The renderer will read it and will ramp. Everything in the renderer operates on a ramp basis, as to everything, position, snap, all these parameters that we talked about are all based on where the renderer is going. It's like, okay, here's my target, and I'm going to get there in a certain amount of time. The ramp usually is defined by the codec. So again, like I'm going to transition from this point to this point in 32 milliseconds, for example. And all of the objects and all the other parameters that are present in the master, when they change, that's the duration over which you're going to transition to that new state. So it's always smooth. And yeah, no glitches.
Great. Ryan also asks, in headphones, when comparing a stereo mix to Atmos binaural for punch, binaural still sounds better to me when LCR is off as opposed to near. What are your thoughts on this, David?
My thoughts are that this isn't it great that we give the opportunity to provide off? But the flip side of that is, yes, I think that you get some punch there, or in certain use cases you get punch, and if that is what you feel it's missing, then that's fine. I think the challenge with that, or the thing that we would like to see, is whether that is whether that's resolvable in other ways, whether once you get away from that very, as I say, kind of direct injection, is how I tend to think of sort of off and traditional headphone experiences. If you're able to get away from that concept of direct injection and start thinking about, well, how does the mix work without that? I think that you can start to get to some really powerful experiences where you don't need to go as far as just, okay, everything that was there now needs to be an off. Maybe there's an element that needs to be an off, but you can still create space around it. To me, where this goes, and if we are going to get to Brian's question, sort of that recreation of the magic of the mix in the room, just defaulting everything to off because it's sort of familiar and how we're used to that translation working can be, that can be a backward step, versus figuring out, well, what does it actually mean to have that room type experience and that room type magic, and be able to take advantage of the space and the depth that you could get in the room. The way to do that is through not just saying, okay, everything now has to be in far and see what happens, and oh, I don't like it and I've lost all my punch, but it's like, how do I actually utilize the controls to to keep the essence of the mix and the master, but also have that sense of space. So it's a bit of a non-answer because I can't say, no, that's not right, there's more punch in this other mode. It just depends, and if that's what you're finding, then that's what it is. But I do think that we've got a lot of examples of people who have managed to, you know, maybe there's a moment of like, well, hang on a minute, that's not how I'm used to something translating to direct injection, but it works in the context of what the mix was supposed to be.
Thank you. Thank you. Robert Friedrich asks, how is this metadata archived? What is its language? Where is it embedded? Can it be exported and repopulated?
Oof,
good.
Great question. Okay, so all of the metadata that we talked about today is stored in both the Dolby Atmos file, the DAM for .atmos file set, the thing that we natively create in the renderer. It's also all stored in the ADM format. It is stored in different bits of the ADM format. So some of the positional stuff, or all of the positional stuff and size, you know, those things are all stored within the standard ADM XML chunk. There are some other parts that are very Dolby specific, and not in sort of a weird proprietary way, but just in a, we're the only people who use it, and our codecs are the only thing that can use it. And so it's hard to get some of those things in standardized file formats that we put in a DBMD chunk. So we have a header chunk within the WAV file that stores many of those settings, as opposed to it being in the standard XML payload, ADM payload. But if you set all of those settings, so everything we talked about today, when you export an ADM file, they're all in there. They're all in that file. When you bring that into a digital audio workstation, it should be honoring all of those files. We work hard within our deployment within the ecosystem, working with various DAW manufacturers, working on our own internal tools to try and ensure that all of this metadata is honored throughout, and is not just dropped on the floor at any point. Now, what you do with those files, as we've all lived through various worlds of metadata embedded within audio files, there are things that can look very innocent, and it's like, oh, I'm going to do this thing to this file, and it turns out all your metadata's gone. I can't solve for that, but certainly within the things that are Dolby Atmos tools, they should be honoring all of those. So in terms of like being able to get back to your settings, that should all be within that master file.
May I ask a related question real quick to metadata? Is there extra room in there? Are you looking at, and will it be possible to have extra, as we think of metadata, certainly within, you know, Recording Academy and the music business as well, encoded things like titles and ISRC codes and UPC codes and, you know, markers and things like that?
You know, as everyone likes to say,
talk about it, yeah.
Everything is possible.
Okay.
Metadata is, you know, oh, Christine.
If I can just jump in,
Please.
that's a function incorporated within DDEX standard as well, of course. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I don't think we're in a position to answer it right this minute, but I think that that's something the industry is all certainly contemplating for Atmos already. I don't know how close you are to it, Michael. We've actually joined DDEX as well. And so,
and I think the important point there is we want to make sure that we're not sort of bundling up within the Dolby piece, because it might be the easiest way to do it quickly, things that should really be part of a different set of metadata. So it's about having the right bits of metadata in the right place and collected in the right way. So yes, there's always space to do things like that, but we're trying to make sure we're working with the industry to make sure that all of those things are done in a way that serves the industry as a whole.
yep.
I totally get that. I appreciate that. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. It's not
Exactly.
practice moving forward.
Exactly.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, great. So a couple more. I'm going to move a little bit faster just because we've had a new rush, which is really exciting. Okay, so are there ever this is Kevin Woods, are there ever phase issues when an object is phantom panned? If there are, how is it resolved?
I don't want to say no, there never are, because I don't feel like I can stand behind that definitive of a statement. But you know, the Atmos renderer has been around and in production for 10 plus years now, and in development for a lot longer than that. And a lot of these kind of early we had bumps as things moved around. Like, we've gone through a lot of iteration to get to the point where things like this are not issues that we tend to run into. But sure, anytime you phantom pan something, you could run into those issues, but it's not something that I hear about or have heard about or get feedback about regularly. And I have a decent confidence that we've worked through any kind of outlying issues there.
Perfect. If 512 trims are necessary for smooth translation, why not make them part of your processing, David?
Well, I think Mike mentioned there are automatic default trims for all of this, and that's what the automatic trims are, sort of our best attempt of the safest do no harm thing that we could possibly do. And the manual trims are the way to go in. And if you want to do something different now, again, with music, we found that actually we're maybe being overly aggressive with the trims and people want to pull it back up without causing issues. But I would say that the defaults are the most do no harm. And so that is built into the processing.
Terrific. I just want to acknowledge Matt Levine has asked a good question I do want to try to get to. So bear with me, Matt. I haven't forgotten, and I would like to make time for that. Okay. Garner McKay asks a good question we get quite a bit, actually. Is there a metadata related solution or recommendation for avoiding the potential cutoff of the first bit of audio on playback of a song? This is a long one, so somebody take a look at this with me. On some streaming services, particularly when matching stereo mix audio that starts audio very quickly, or is this just a current streaming player issue? Sometimes we're not allowed a second of silence or so at the beginning to avoid missing the first few notes on the streaming playback. Apple has an issue with some songs I reference. Yes, aware of this question. Can somebody
Save the intro.
Save the intro.
Yeah, save the interest. Yeah, totally.
Okay. Mike?
Yeah, I thought you might say that. So this specific issue is more related to the limitations on HDMI, and if you're connecting to an HDMI device, mostly because those devices are trying to figure out what's coming down the pipe to them in real time. And then once they figure it out, they have to, instantiate their, the right decoder. And unfortunately, they don't do that quickly enough sometimes. I would say the performance there is improving with newer devices, but is not where we want it to be. So it's a problem we understand. It's not something that we have. I can give a timeline on a solution. We certainly are in discussions with, companies like Apple and others that are building the sort of HDMI source devices, things like Apple TV, as to ways to prevent this from happening, because we do know how that can be prevented. But it requires that transmission device to do some, smarter things with their HDMI output to prevent that format switching from happening all the time in the receiving device.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah.
Okay, I am going to get to Matt Levine's question because there are still several questions about loudness, and I think while it's a little bit off of topic from what we covered today, it still reared its head through a number of folks who wrote in, and it's reasonable. So I know this isn't exactly what we're talking about, he says. However, this is the perfect group of people to ask. You are correct. Should I be avoiding any clipping on the meters in the render, or are a few overs acceptable? If I hit minus 18 dB on the Dolby Atmos integrated loudness, the binaural integrated loudness is about 4 dB louder. Which one should be at least 18 dB, minus 18 dB?
You're asking the clipping police a clipping question.
Do it.
Clipping is forbidden. You must never clip. How dare you? No, not entirely. Mr. Gould, do you want to pick this one, or do you want me to do it?
I mean, look, I don't know. I maybe have a non-Dolby answer to this, and then Mike, I'll let you give the Dolby answer, which is, if it sounds good, it probably is good in terms of the clipping red light thing. I've seen some very clipped mixes that sound just fine, but that's probably not the proper answer to this question. So Mike, why don't you give the proper answer?
I mean, with respect to your sort of the key question is, I mean, the minus 18 target, and also the sort of true peak recommendations apply to the Dolby Atmos loudness measurement. And if you're hitting minus 18 and keeping true peaks below, I think, about 1 dB, things mostly work out okay on the binaural mix, yes, you may be hitting the limiter, but it shouldn't happen too often. One would note of caution on hitting the limiter. Hitting the limiter in the tools may not necessarily translate fully to what you hear in the consumer playback devices, because there are different headroom management approaches that happen downstream. So if you've sort of mixed to the limiter, really hammered it, yeah, that may not be such an advisable thing to do. Any other comments, Mr. Gould?
Great. Ryan asks, he's got a live album coming out and it needs to be gapless. Transitions are in the applause between songs. If I didn't change the settings, will it be seamless?
Yes.
Okay. Power round. Does the Pro Logic 2 fold down metadata do a 90-degree phase shift to the surrounds and the LTRT fold down?
It can. It's an option in the Downmix settings. So if you actually go into the renderer app, you'll see there's two options for Pro Logic 2, one with and one without. Definitely a good idea to take a listen to that, because depending on the mix, you may get left-right imbalance or you may not. So yes, both options are available. Take a listen.
Terrific. Ryan says yay about the seamless for his live album.
And we're going to send him your email address in case when his album comes out, there are any glitches.
Understood, and I'll send them straight to the playback company. All right, very good.
All right, so Robert Friedrich asks, it would be great to be able to export this information into something like an XML. This was the metadata conversation.
Right. And then the one above, will there be information in the BEX chunk? I don't think we saw any of this in the BEX chunk.
No.
It's all in the AXML. I mean, yep. The ADM metadata is all stored as XML within the AXML chunk. It is natively that. I mean, being able to do kind of a mass sort of export of it. There are tools that you can view it. I don't know, Mike, if you want to talk about that. There are ways that you can view it. Can you then do a mass export into an XML? I don't think so. But if it's more about just kind of being able to actually see it, there are tools that can do that.
Yep. I mean, it's, as you say, it's native XML, and it doesn't take a lot. I mean, I can do it, so it can't be that challenging. Drop your ADM into a hex editor, and you can literally go read the metadata, and then you can export that byte range, and then you have a perfect XML document should you wish to do so. And somebody could easily script up a process to go do that should you wish to do so. The additional metadata, the DBMD metadata, is a little more challenging because that is not human readable. It is a serialized format, so that's a little trickier for some of the parameters. But again, it is there. If you want to review the sort of the metadata for a file quickly, actually one of the tools we recommend is Media Info, which probably you've already got. The latest version, 22.06. We did a lot of work with the developers there to have that tool report out all of the metadata, ADM, as well as the Dolby Atmos specific metadata into the media, using the Media Info tool. And that has a stack of different export functions, so you can then grab that and save it as XML or whatever you wish to do so. So that's another path that you can take.
Gentlemen, we are at time. Thank you very, very much. This has been incredible.
Everybody, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much for David. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Christine. And
thanks for having us.
Thank you.
What a great conversation, everybody. I hope it's been helpful. Really.
Thank you for all of the excellent questions, for everyone who submitted. I mean, incredibly well thought out and perfect questions for this team.
Great crew on the Q&A. Yes.
So we're planning to be back 2 weeks from now with another episode, same time, noon Pacific. And we will be talking about learning, education, support, and other things, right, guys? Okay.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you,
everybody.